The shocking dilemma: would you sacrifice one to save five? Alright, let's start with a question, one that's simple on the surface, yet profoundly complicated when you sit with it long enough. Imagine this: you're standing next to a set of train tracks. In the distance, you see a runaway train barreling toward five people who are tied to the tracks. They can't escape, and if the train continues on its path, they will die. But here's the twist: there's a lever next to you. If you pull the lever, the train will switch tracks, avoiding the five people. The catch: there's one person tied to the alternate track. If you pull the lever, that one person will die instead. So what do you do? Do you let the train run its course and allow the five to die? Or do you intervene, actively choosing to sacrifice the one in order to save the five? It's a classic thought experiment called the trolley problem, and it's been haunting philosophers and ethicists for decades. But here's the real kicker: this isn't just some abstract mental exercise. It's a question that forces us to confront the deepest, most uncomfortable truths about morality, responsibility, and what it means to be human. At first glance, the answer might seem obvious, right? Save the five after all. 5 lives are worth more than one. But here's where it gets tricky. By pulling the lever, you're no longer a passive observer. You're now an active participant in the situation. You're making a deliberate choice to sacrifice someone. That's different, isn't it? Suddenly, it's not just about numbers, it's about responsibility. If you do nothing, you might feel guilt, but you could argue that the outcome wasn't your fault. But if you intervene, you're directly responsible for someone's death, even if your actions saved more lives overall. So, what's the right choice? And here's a deeper question: is there even such a thing as a right choice in this situation? This is where philosophy comes in. Thinkers like Jeremy Bentham, the father of utilitarianism, would argue that the decision is clear: you pull the lever. Why? Because utilitarianism is all about maximizing happiness and minimizing suffering. By saving 5 lives at the cost of one, you're reducing the overall harm in the world. The numbers don't lie, right? But not everyone agrees with this line of thinking. Immanuel Kant, one of the most influential philosophers in history, would probably say that pulling the lever is wrong. Why? Because Kant believed in something called the categorical imperative. Essentially, he argued that we should act according to universal moral principles, rules that apply to everyone, in every situation. And one of those principles is that we should never treat people as mere means to an end. In this case, pulling the lever treats the one person on the alternate track as a means to save the 5. By sacrificing them, you're violating their intrinsic dignity as a human being. So now we have 2 competing perspectives. On one hand, utilitarianism tells us to focus on the outcome, to make the choice that results in the greatest good for the greatest number. On the other hand, Kantian ethics tells us to focus on the action itself, to respect the inherent value of every individual, regardless of the consequences. So, who's right? And more importantly, what would you do?
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound spiritual lesson.
Before you answer, let me complicate things even further. What if the one person on the alternate track wasn't a stranger? What if it was someone you loved, your best friend, your sibling, your child? Suddenly, the numbers don't seem so straightforward, do they? And what if the 5 people on the main track weren't strangers either? What if they were 5 people who had committed terrible crimes? Would that change your decision? Here's the uncomfortable truth: there are no easy answers to this dilemma. Every choice you make comes with consequences, and every consequence is tied to a set of values that might conflict with each other. Do you prioritize the greater good, or do you uphold moral principles? Do you act out of logic, or do you let emotion guide your decision? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, is it even possible to make a truly moral decision in a situation like this? As we dig deeper into this dilemma, it becomes clear that it's not just about trains and tracks. It's a reflection of the choices we face in everyday life. Think about it, how often are we put in situations where we have to weigh the needs of the many against the needs of the few? Maybe it's deciding how to allocate limited resources, like time, money, or energy. Maybe it's navigating conflicts in relationships or at work. Or maybe it's something as simple as choosing between personal ambition and the well-being of others. Here's something to consider. Does the way we answer the trolley problem reveal something fundamental about who we are? Are you someone who focuses on the bigger picture, willing to make difficult sacrifices for the greater good? Or are you someone who stands by universal principles, refusing to compromise your values no matter the cost? And if so, what does that say about the kind of person you want to be? The weight of responsibility when action and inaction both have a price. Let's pick up where we left off. This dilemma, the choice to act or not act, is more than just a hypothetical scenario. It's a mirror reflecting the human condition, forcing us to confront a fundamental truth: every choice we make has a cost. And sometimes, the hardest choices aren't between right and wrong, but between two competing goods or two unavoidable bads. The trolley problem doesn't just challenge our ethics, it forces us to wrestle with the weight of responsibility. Think about it. If you do nothing in the scenario, the train will kill 5 people. You could argue that this outcome isn't your fault after all. You didn't set the train in motion, and you didn't tie anyone to the tracks. But by standing there and choosing not to act, you're allowing the tragedy to unfold. Your inaction becomes a choice in itself. So, here's the question: is inaction morally neutral? Or is it just as significant and culpable as action? This is where things get really uncomfortable. Because deep down, most of us want to believe that if we simply stay out of a situation, we're absolved of responsibility. But is that true? Imagine you're walking past a shallow pond and you see a child drowning. You have the ability to save them, but doing so would ruin your expensive new shoes. Would you hesitate? Probably not. Inaction in that moment would feel immoral, wouldn't it? Philosopher Peter Singer uses this example to argue that in many cases, failing to act when you have the power to prevent harm is just as wrong as directly causing harm. But let's bring it back to the trolley problem. If pulling the lever is an action that makes you responsible for the death of one person, isn't not pulling the lever also an action? After all, by choosing not to intervene, you're allowing 5 people to die. This is what makes moral responsibility so heavy. There's no escape from it. Whether you act or don't act, you're still making a choice, and every choice comes with consequences. So let's ask a deeper question: what does it mean to bear responsibility for another person's life? Is it fair to place that burden on yourself? Or is it something we all carry, whether we realize it or not? And perhaps more importantly, how do we live with the choices we make when there's no clear right answer? This is where philosophy meets psychology. Studies show that when people are faced with moral dilemmas, like the trolley problem, they often experience something called moral distress. It's that gut-wrenching feeling that no matter what you do, you're going to feel like you've done something wrong. And that's because dilemmas like this force us to confront the limits of our own morality. We want to be good people, but what does good even mean when every option leads to harm? Let's complicate things further. Imagine a slight variation of the trolley problem. Instead of a lever, you're standing on a bridge above the tracks, and next to you is a very large man. The only way to stop the train from killing the 5 people is to physically push the man off the bridge and onto the tracks, where his body will stop the train. Now, does your answer change? For many people it does. Even though the outcome is the same, sacrificing one life to save 5, there's something about physically pushing someone to their death that feels far worse than pulling a lever. Why? Is it because pushing someone feels more personal, more deliberate? Or is it because we're hardwired to recoil from actions that require direct violence, even if the logic behind them is the same? This distinction between direct and indirect harm is something philosophers have debated for centuries. Utilitarians would argue that it doesn't matter the numbers or what count, but most of us don't live purely by utilitarian logic. We're emotional beings, guided by instincts, values, and a sense of personal responsibility. And this is what makes dilemmas like this so agonizing. They force us to choose between our logical mind and our emotional heart. So, here's another question to sit with when you're faced with a moral choice. How much of your decision is based on logic, and how much is based on emotion? And can the two ever truly align? The truth is, life is full of moments where we have to make decisions that carry weight, sometimes literal life and death consequences. And while the trolley problem is just a thought experiment, it reflects real-world choices we face all the time. Think about doctors deciding how to allocate limited resources in a hospital, or leaders making policy decisions that will inevitably benefit some people while harming others. Or even simpler, everyday situations where you have to choose between helping a friend in need or prioritizing your own well-being. These moments may not involve runaway trains, but they carry the same fundamental question: what do we owe to others? And what are we willing to sacrifice to fulfill that obligation? So, let me ask you this: how do you decide what's right when both options feel wrong? And more importantly, how do you carry the weight of your decision once it's made? The search for meaning, what the trolley problem teaches us about life's hardest choices. Let's step back for a moment and ask ourselves, why does the trolley problem resonate so deeply with us? Why has this thought experiment endured for decades, sparking endless debates, arguments, and reflections? It's not just because it's a clever puzzle. It's because it forces us to wrestle with something universal: the complexity of moral decision-making and the search for meaning in the face of impossible choices. And whether we realize it or not, the choices we make in these moments, big or small, shape who we are and how we navigate the world. At its core, the trolley problem is a reflection of life itself. Life is messy, filled with trade-offs, gray areas, and situations where no choice feels completely right. We all want to believe that we're good people, that we'll do the right thing when the moment comes. But what happens when there is no clear right answer? What happens when every path forward is paved with sacrifice, guilt, or uncertainty? These are the moments that test us, not just intellectually, but emotionally, spiritually, and even existentially. Here's a deeper layer to consider. The trolley problem forces us to confront the tension between our individual values and the broader systems we're part of. On one hand, we might value compassion, empathy, and the intrinsic worth of every human being. On the other hand, we live in a world that often demands utilitarian calculations, choices that prioritize the greater good, even if it means sacrificing the few for the many. Think about it: governments, businesses, and even everyday social structures are constantly making decisions that weigh the needs of the majority against the rights of the individual. The trolley problem is, in many ways, a microcosm of this tension. But here's the twist: while the trolley problem seems to be about morality, it's also about identity. The way we respond to this dilemma reveals not just what we value, but who we are. Are you someone who prioritizes logic and efficiency, even if it means making hard sacrifices? Or are you someone who follows your emotions and principles, even when they conflict with the greater good? And perhaps most importantly, how do you reconcile the gap between who you want to be and the choices you're forced to make? Let's ground this in real life. Imagine being a doctor in an overwhelmed hospital during a crisis. You only have one ventilator left, but there are two patients who need it. One is a young person with a high chance of survival, and the other is an older person with a lower chance of recovery. Who do you choose? You can't save both, and whichever decision you make will likely haunt you. This isn't just a theoretical dilemma, it's a reality that many people face every day. And it forces us to ask, how do we find meaning in choices that leave us feeling fractured, conflicted, or even guilty? One way to approach this is by accepting a difficult truth: life isn't about avoiding hard choices, it's about learning to live with them. This doesn't mean we should become cold or detached, but rather that we need to cultivate a kind of moral resilience. We need to recognize that no decision will ever be perfect, and that sometimes the best we can do is act with integrity, compassion, and the willingness to take responsibility for the consequences. Here's another layer to think about: the trolley problem isn't just about the choices we make, it's about the stories we tell ourselves afterward. When you pull the lever or decide not to, what narrative do you create to make sense of your actions? Do you tell yourself you were acting for the greater good? Do you focus on the pain of the sacrifice or the lives you saved? These stories matter because they shape how we carry the weight of our decisions. They help us find meaning, even in the face of loss, regret, or uncertainty. Let me ask you this: what stories do you tell yourself about the hard choices you've made in your own life? Have you forgiven yourself for the times you couldn't save everyone, or do you still carry the guilt? And how do those experiences shape the way you approach future decisions? This brings us to a profound insight: the trolley problem isn't just about the people on the tracks. It's about us. It's about our relationship with responsibility, sacrifice, and the search for meaning in a world that often feels chaotic and unforgiving. And perhaps the most important lesson is this: there's no single right answer, but there is always an opportunity to learn, grow, and deepen our understanding of what it means to be human. So, what can we take away from all of this? First, that morality isn't a fixed set of rules, it's a process. It's something we wrestle with, question, and refine through experience. Second, that the weight of responsibility is something we all carry, whether we act or remain passive. And third, that even in the face of impossible choices, we have the power to create meaning not by avoiding conflict, but by engaging with it fully, honestly, and courageously. Here's one final question to leave you with when the moment comes and you're faced with your own trolley problem. How will you decide? And how will you live with the person you become as a result? Beyond the tracks, what the trolley problem teaches us about building a better world. Now that we've explored the moral weight of the trolley problem and what it reveals about our values, let's take a step back and ask, what does this thought experiment teach us about the world we live in? And how can it help us create a better future? Because while the trolley problem feels like an isolated scenario, its lessons extend far beyond the tracks. It's not just about individual choices, it's about the systems we create, the values we uphold as a society, and the legacy we leave behind. Here's the thing: the trolley problem forces us into a reactive role. We're placed into a situation where the tracks are already laid, the train is already moving, and we're simply trying to minimize harm. But why should we accept a world where these kinds of dilemmas are inevitable? What if, instead of just debating whether to pull the lever, we asked a deeper question: why are people tied to the tracks in the first place? Think about it: so many of the moral dilemmas we face aren't accidents of fate. They're the result of choices we've made as a society, whether consciously or unconsciously. Take the example of the overwhelmed hospital during a crisis. The shortage of ventilators isn't just a medical issue, it's a reflection of broader systemic failures, like underfunded healthcare systems, unequal access to resources, and a lack of preparedness for emergencies. The same applies to countless other problems: climate change, poverty, inequality. These are the runaway trains of our world, and far too often we find ourselves reacting to crises instead of addressing their root causes. So, here's a radical idea. What if we stopped thinking of ourselves as bystanders at the tracks and started seeing ourselves as engineers of the system? What if, instead of accepting the tracks as they are, we work to redesign them to create a world where these moral dilemmas become less frequent, less severe, or maybe even obsolete? Of course, this raises its own set of challenges. Building a better world means confronting uncomfortable truths about power, privilege, and responsibility. It means asking hard questions like who benefits from the way things are, who gets left behind, and what sacrifices are we willing to make to create a more just and equitable society? These aren't easy questions to answer, but they're essential if we want to move beyond simply reacting to crises and start preventing them. Here's another layer to consider. The trolley problem also teaches us the importance of empathy. When we're faced with these moral dilemmas, it's easy to reduce people to numbers, to see them as abstract figures in a moral equation, rather than as individuals with lives, dreams, and loved ones. But if we're going to build a better world, we need to resist this kind of dehumanization. We need to remember that behind every statistic is a story, and behind every choice is a person. Empathy doesn't erase the difficulty of moral decisions, but it reminds us why those decisions matter in the first place. So, how do we take these lessons and apply them to our lives? First, we can start by looking at the systems we're part of: our workplaces, communities, and governments, and asking, are these systems designed to minimize harm and maximize well-being? Or are they creating the very dilemmas we're trying to solve? Second, we can cultivate a mindset of proactive responsibility. Instead of waiting for the train to arrive, we can ask, what can I do now to prevent harm in the future? And finally, we can commit to seeing others, whether they're the one or the five, as full human beings, worthy of dignity and compassion. Let me leave you with this: the trolley problem isn't just a thought experiment, it's a call to action. It challenges us to think deeply about our values, to take responsibility for our choices, and to imagine a world where those choices are guided not by fear or guilt, but by a vision of what's possible. So, the next time you find yourself standing at the tracks, whether literally or metaphorically, ask yourself not just what you would do in that moment, but what you can do today to build a world where fewer trains are ever set in motion. And here's the final question for you to reflect on. If our lives are a series of choices that ripple outward, what kind of legacy will your choices leave behind?